Nuclear Warfare Policy, Cold War to Today, Introduction and Part 1. Introduction and National Security Council Directive 18, August 1977. Quote, "We haven't arrived at our present dilemma by accident or mischance. We were bound to get here eventually because civilization was bound to endow us eventually with the power to destroy ourselves." End quote. Gwen Dyer, War, 1983. Introduction. One of the defining characteristics of the Cold War was the world living under the threat of nuclear weapons and the ever-looming threat of nuclear war. The threat of nuclear war was so prevalent that it became part of pop culture, influencing songs like Iron Maiden's 2 Minutes to Midnight and Nena's 99 Luftballons, or 99 Red Balloons, as well as films like Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove and ABC's TV movie The Day After. When the Cold War ended on December 25, 1991, with the peaceful, relative, dissolution of the Soviet Union, the threat of worldwide nuclear annihilation dramatically declined. Although the threat of nuclear war remained, its influence on society was significantly decreased as other factors have taken the place of the dominant thoughts that once caused anxiety or resignation during the Cold War. A chance for a new chapter was before the world without the overarching threat of a general nuclear war. Has the world missed an opportunity as nuclear discussion and threats loom once more? The idea of nuclear war has never gone away, but the magnitude of the threat has diminished. The examples of continued post-war nuclear threats were from the threat of regional nuclear wars, such as between Pakistan and India, when tensions increased between the two countries in 1998, when the two countries conducted 11 total nuclear tests in May due to ongoing tensions. The UN Security Council did something unheard of today and saw 5 permanent members condemn India and Pakistan for their actions. The post-Cold War nuclear threat came from a rogue state like North Korea or terrorists like using the black market nuclear weapons or a dirty bomb. As serious as these threats were, they did not rise to the tensions of the Cold War nuclear capabilities and the threats between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. The current environment is witnessing a shift with the concept of a nuclear arms race emerging between old Cold War adversaries. The Ukraine war and the threats of the use of nuclear weapons are now becoming commonplace and theatrically performative, as Soviet Premier Khrushchev's "We will bury you" speech in 1956. In addition, China is pursuing a rapid increase in strategic nuclear weapons to reach peer status with both the United States and Russia. All 3 countries are actively upgrading their strategic and theater-level nuclear forces, aiming to replace outdated Cold War-era weapons and introduce new capabilities like hybrid hypersonic missiles armed with nuclear warheads, and previously banned intermediate-range nuclear missiles. It also includes the introduction of the once limited deployment of anti-ballistic missiles, or ABMs, that were considered defensive systems, but also have an alternate logic of increasing the likelihood of the country with the ABM systems relying on a potential invulnerability of their ABMs to initiate a launch of a first nuclear strike to destroy their enemy, who would have their counterstrike negated by an effective ABM system. So the way to defeat ABMs is to create more missiles and warheads that overwhelm the capabilities of the ABM system, which result in a new nuclear arms race. The political leaders around the world are back into camps along polarizing lines. The U.S. and Russia view it more as another bipolar order, and China claims it is a multipolar world as it refuses to participate in, quote, Cold War mentality, end quote, as it participates in, quote, Cold War mentality, end quote. China is right from one perspective. The Cold War was defined by 2 peer nuclear powers with nearly 51,000 warheads between them. And this new world order will include 3 peer nuclear powers, though with significantly fewer warheads. How how this will turn out and how the leaders will address the obstacles and pitfalls is yet to be determined. The fact that the Ukraine war has been allowed to fester to the current point, and world leaders have focused on a China policy based on profits and broken promises over long-term security. These two events have given the world an indication of the caliber of these new leaders that will dance with the nuclear devil that should have been buried in December 1991. Perhaps some new pop songs will emerge from these events, evoking nostalgia of the Cold War and this new nuclear threat. This is the opening article in an ongoing series that will be added weekly to the site on the various aspects of the evolution of nuclear policy of the Cold War and, when applicable, how it relates to today's nuclear threat environment. The technologies and personalities have changed between the Cold War and today, but it is appropriate to sum up the current environment by stating, quote, the more things change, the more they stay the same, end quote, and discover if this adage holds true. Part 1, Presidential Directive NSC 18. November 1976 saw the election of President Jimmy Carter, who took office in January 1977. President Carter came into office during a period of relative calm in the international relations between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, known as détente. During the period of détente, the U.S. and Soviet Union negotiated and ratified the Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty, known as SALT I, the ABM Treaty, and even extended détente into the space race with a cooperative joint space mission called the Apollo-Soyuz mission in 1975. President Carter inherited the SALT II negotiations and was intending to continue the cooperation between the two superpowers. Despite the reduced tensions when he took office, nuclear treaties and ongoing negotiations, the two powers' nuclear philosophy remained based on mutually assured destruction, or MAD. It was also evident that both sides were exploring ways to deviate from the unsatisfactory MAD policy, either through negotiated disarmament or a shift in nuclear doctrine. Like all other presidents since President Truman, President Carter routinely reviewed his nuclear policies to ensure they aligned with his national objectives and kept pace with the evolving technologies, warhead inventory, and geopolitical situations. In a document known as NSC 18, President Carter sent a directive to his National Security Council, or NSC, focusing on the, quote, U.S. national strategy, end quote. The directive was issued to Vice President Walter Mondale, Secretary of State Cyrus Vance Sr., and Secretary of Defense Harold Brown, along with the OMB Director, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Director of Central Intelligence Agency, the Director of the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, and the Special Assistant to the President for Nuclear Security Affairs, with a date of August 24, 1977, and it was classified as top secret. The document was relatively short and covered the below topics. The introduction, which was based on internal discussions from the Special Coordination Committee, strategic force objectives, strategic programs, strategic targeting policy, general purpose forces, NATO, global contingencies, Asia, and additional studies. The term, quote, strategic, end quote, in the document is a reference to U.S. strategic nuclear forces, which compose of the U.S. nuclear triad. The strategic force objectives are for the U.S. to maintain its current strength and to stay relative to the Soviet Union to deter an attack against itself or its allies, as well as to deter the escalation of non-nuclear war, mainly in NATO and Asia. The directive, released on August 1977, established the U.S. position under a new president who had been in office for only 7 months. President Carter stated that he wanted to maintain an equivalency force relative to the Soviet Union, which supported the MAD doctrine. However, the, quote, strategic targeting policy section of the directive marked a seismic change to this decades-old long policy. Only 3 sentences made up the, quote, strategic targeting policy, end quote, section, yet these sentences fundamentally altered the U.S. strategic nuclear policy. Despite detente, there were indications that superpower tensions were on the rise, and the U.S. intelligence was concerned with nuclear developments in the Soviet Union. This section required a review and update of U.S. nuclear targeting plans if deterrence failed and a nuclear conflict begins. The review was delivered its results in November 1977 with instructions to provide options for a, quote, limited retaliatory response designed to control the escalation and flexibly respond to aggression, end quote. The MAD doctrine was to threaten a, quote, nuclear spasm, end quote, that would occur when nuclear deterrence fails. This nuclear spasm was when both sides committed all their nuclear forces to destroy each other. NSC 18 altered this situation by proposing an updated policy for a limited nuclear war. The directive continues, stating that the U.S. target plan aims to limit damage to the U.S. and its allies as much as possible, deliver an unacceptable amount of damage to the Soviet Union, and force a termination of the nuclear exchange on terms most favorable to the U.S. A new targeting review was to determine what would be required to create the, quote, unacceptable levels of damage to the Soviet Union, end quote. This doctrine did not necessarily change the U.S. stated position of no first use of nuclear weapons, but does state a goal of, quote, flexibly respond to aggression, end quote. This directive stated that while it did not change the public position, the review should take into account the possibility of a U.S. first strike. The section continues by stating that U.S. targeting plans should maintain a secure reserve force for potential use after a major nuclear exchange. This implies the availability of a second strike by the U.S., one that would be sufficiently powerful to incentivize the Soviet Union to seek cessation of hostilities in favor of the U.S. This section indicates the U.S. was adopting a, quote, winnable, end quote, nuclear war, creating a variant of the counterforce doctrine that specifically targeted war-making infrastructure. The reserve force was an indication that it was to provide a counter-value force that was specifically meant to target the Soviet cities and, more importantly, their populations. Targeting populations and cities was a primary component of MAD. President Carter's NSC 18 was top secret, but it set the U.S. on a policy position that nuclear war was not a war to be fought and won, and not just purely deterrent policy that was found in MAD. MAD was still a legitimate doctrine, though force equivalency was still a key component of U.S. nuclear policy. However, this presidential directive introduced a new option, shifting from strategic nuclear mutual doomsday to a limited war. This new focus was on using nuclear weapons to win a nuclear war with the Soviet Union, which did not necessarily result in the complete annihilation of each country and its allies. The terms winning and losing in a nuclear war are relative, given that even a limited nuclear war is likely to result in millions to tens of millions of casualties. Even a winner in a nuclear war is likely to face catastrophic and potentially politically fatal casualties. Unanswered was whether nuclear power like the U.S. or the Soviet Union would accept the defeat of losing a nuclear war, or if they would just use the action-reaction cycle to escalate to a general nuclear war and engage in counter-value targeting. President Carter might have responded to reports of a shift of the Soviet nuclear doctrine as both sides explored alternates to a catastrophic nuclear war. Regardless, the limited nuclear war doctrine has gained widespread acceptance since the end of the Cold War and continues to this day.